And we're back, and as we all know, good things are worth waiting for, especially when you have Raiders of the Lost Ark playing. I'm here today on the Artis with Ivy Reiss, and I'm the host, Ivy Reiss, and this is my guest, Georgia Wilder. She is a sessional prof, artist, poet, and today we will be talking about the rise of the first-person voice and how that is authentic in academia and the arts and how it is changing our culture. Everyone please welcome Georgia.
So nice to be here. Thank you so much, Ivy.
Yes. Now I'd like to give people a little bit of more of a background. So you're coming out with a new book, and we'll talk about that a little bit at the end, but you're one of Canada's top 3 poets, but you've been spending the last 15 years or so in academia, and you've seen the shift with first-person voice becoming, I should say, the standard in writing when it comes to both science papers and arts papers, essays. And but you were writing a lot of creative work prior to going back to school and then becoming a professor, and you put a bit of that creativity on side. You've published many academic works since. And tell me a little bit about that, because then that kind of pulls us into how it's the creative versus the academic and where we are today.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. That's absolutely true. I started university as a mature student at 25. I didn't have the opportunity to go to university earlier, so I was one of those people who's like at the front of the class with their hand up all the time, and I was,
that was
really
me too.
yeah, and it was such an awesome opportunity. And when I was an undergrad, I worked on the varsity under Naomi Klein. I wrote poems and short stories for the Trinity Review, and I had a lot of works. I had a couple of plays produced at Hart House, and it was just an awesome time. And I loved academia so much that when I went through this whirlwind of undergrad, I just sort of instantly went into my master's program. And the whole idea of the master's program was to get into the PhD program. So I said to myself, it's only a year. I'll put my creative work on hold, work on my master's, and then once I'm successfully into the PhD program, then of course I'll have time to go back to my creative writing.
And then you were focused
and
on...
then actually that didn't happen. It was, the more that, I became involved in my thesis and writing then, articles for, peer-reviewed journals and, writing, more academic work, and then, it's kind of it's a strange thing, because you think that you want to pursue literature to have all this time to read, and you're reading mostly undergraduate papers and things you need to read and to teach and
researching.
Yeah. I mean, researching is lovely, right? That's what it's all about.
Well.
I love researching. It's like being a detective down in the catacombs of the library and, that kind of thing.
But I remember you told me your dissertation topic was actually really interesting. What was it again?
Well, my dissertation, and I'm still excited about it. It was 17th century political pamphlets. So during the pamphlet wars of the 17th century, when censorship collapsed in England, and all different sorts of people, apprentices, women, people who were, in a kind of underclass who didn't have access to the press previously, were becoming literate and were publishing. So it's almost this like 17th century blogosphere of pseudonymous and anonymous writers and, controversial work.
That, absolutely, what's interesting about that, and that our viewers will see how that links in, but I mean, it's really cool because, like, the women were hiding the pamphlets in their...
Yeah, in their petticoats and hawking them in the streets, and, hiding little, small printing presses in their own homes, and it became an era where women were very involved in the printing industry.
And then it kind of a suppression came thereafter.
Oh, absolutely.
Which is what's interesting, but relates to what we're getting, but also, so there was that rise with females being involved, and then the propaganda pamphlets, which is essentially the beginning of, or would you say it's the beginning of the objective? Well, I mean, propaganda is meant to influence. So when we talk about the objective versus subjective voice and third person versus first person, those pamphlets really, do you think, how did they relate to the the voice that was used? Because I remember from our discussion.
Well, it was really, I mean, you know, a multivocal atmosphere, right? So it wasn't really kind of one voice or another voice. I mean, there were all different types of levels, registers, emerging voices, that kind of thing. I think when we're talking about objective versus subjective, we're talking more about the sort of what we use in academia as the voice of the critic, right? How you're supposed to, you know, as a student, develop a particular voice, and what students expect in the way of how they're supposed to, kind of come up with a voice that they use in their essays and then, you know, later on in published work.
Absolutely, and then that relates to, you know, again, the passive active voice. So when someone is speaking about the sciences, and with the beaker, for example, I know you gave me a really good example, but are you...
Sure. Yeah, so I think, you know, something like what we think traditionally as that we think, well, with authenticity, I think that, you know, this is sort of, for me, the most important thing, because if you're trying to sound like someone else, you know, you're never really going to be credited for who you are. Your own innovations, your own, you know, experience of the world is just going to be hidden all the time, right? And that's the kind of thing that I think people sometimes, you know, coming into university, think that they're supposed to sound like somebody else, like some dead white man with a long white beard. And so they use these sort of passive voice expressions to hide themselves, right? So, you know, expressions like "it can be seen that," or "one might believe that," when it doesn't really introduce who you are as a speaker.
Yes.
So typically, like in the lab experiment, right, and this is still like, you know, the methods part of the lab, if you're writing that kind of work, we'll say something like, you know, the substance was placed in the beaker was placed on the Bunsen burner, etc. But that's a kind of like, so it's not really objective. People think that's objectivity, but it's not. It's just a passive voice construction to hide the fact that you are putting the substance in the beaker.
And then again, that comes out of the empirical era from
Sure.
the late 17th century, late 1700s.
Yeah.
But what's really interesting is when it's written in that manner, it actually takes accountability away from the person who's
That's
writing.
exactly it.
And that's where this authenticity, the rise of the first-person voice, is actually bringing authenticity into academia, makes it more relevant to the everyday, because when it's...
Absolutely. So more and more, you know, academic writing will include something like a reflective component. Now, a lab report may not have a reflective component, but it will have a discussion. So you can discuss maybe why your results didn't actually, you know, conform to your hypothesis, right? And you could talk about, you know, maybe what went wrong in the lab, or why there were, you know, aspects of, you know, the equipment that didn't work properly for you, or something like that, right? So that even if you have a lab partner, you pluralize in the first person, you say, you know, this is what we did, it's still an opportunity to then turn around that kind of notion of there being, you know, this removed, you know, universal substance.
Sorry, as if the beaker had not heated up to the correct degree, it's more, this is what we did.
That's right, absolutely. So more and more, I think that, you know, particularly in, you know, not so much lab reports per se, but I think in all of, you know, humanities writing and more and more in science writing, we're asking students to, you know, to figure out how something that they read connects to the world around them, and to give them a sense that what they're doing isn't just anecdotal, it's a kind of case study of the world, and that they can develop an authentic academic voice with the first person.
Well, what I really, really like and think is important is one thing, as something you said to me was, is you said it is not helpful to be didactic. And essentially, if we can relate the authentic experience to everybody, then people who are perceived as marginalized individuals are no longer excluded, because we are no longer identifying our own viewpoints, whoever we, as completely exclusive. So as a result, when the authentic voice rises in academia, and that translates to arts and culture, to how people conduct themselves when they've graduated from university and are looking for a job, for example, I think a lot of us are familiar with how difficult it is for people to find a job after university. And so really, and also in regards to the acceptance of all people and all creeds, cultures, genders, etc. within a society. So that's really where this academic aspect, which I understand the word academia, sometimes has notions with it that may push people away, but actually it's an underpinning, I think, that if the rise of the first person there, then that allows things to be more accessible. What do you think?
Well, absolutely. I think one of the things that's happened to our university is they're becoming increasingly democratized, right? So it's not just this, higher sort of, privileged class that has access to higher learning. And also it's far more multicultural than it used to be, and pluralistic and multilingual. So I think that within the university, there's a huge questioning of Western tradition, of Western anthropology, of Western ways of doing things, and that when we have a big multicultural base and a very international base in our students, we're welcoming them to participate in what university is. So so we're changing. It's not just sort of a Western anthropological view of another country. It's really about everybody kind of being able to shift the university's perspective so that so that academia can be up to date, that it can be international, globalized, and understanding of different worldviews and different viewpoints.
Absolutely, I completely agree, and that is really where the difference between the subjective voice versus the objective voice comes out. Also, because because it's all concept that is kind of eroding away. We are always subjective as people.
Well, I think people misunderstand subjective and objective. Often people think objective is good because it's, that we don't put our subjective opinions or, our biases into things. But there is no such thing as the objective, right? I mean, it's not a voice, it's not, it is something
It's a concept.
It's a concept,
and
it's an
linear.
ideal.
It is, yeah. It's
So
almost linear, like for example, how history books are written. They have a beginning and an end, and it all happened like this, when in fact, you learn in literature there's many truths to every story.
Sure, so,
and nothing
yeah.
is ever linear. And I think you had said that right now we're kind of moving out of this linear by allowing the first person voice.
Absolutely.
And that's where the authenticity comes in.
I think that goes along with it as well, but I think that, that the linear narrative, I think poetry is nonlinear, right?
Yes, and that's what we're coming to
which
in
we're
just a
coming to,
moment.
but also I think our technology today. So we're dealing with websites, for example. So it's not a linear kind of like, although on a computer we might be scrolling through text, which is a very ancient kind of thing to do, we're working with documents that don't go page 1, page 2, page 3, right? That you can jump around on a website and go to different things, and that we do things like mind mapping and that kind of thing in university discussions. So you can present a mind map. So you have an idea and you put it in a circle here, and you have another idea and you put it in a circle there, and you rearrange your circles or squares, should they be squares or whatever. So you can put them on cards, you can use software that mind maps for you and that kind of thing, so that you arrange your ideas in nonlinear ways. You can make a bunch of circles connect to each other.
So essentially they're
Yeah.
kind of helping people to learn to think outside the box, whereas maybe before, would you say it was more about learning to teach, or everything was about teaching someone to think inside the box?
Well, I guess we all construct boxes, right?
Yeah.
It's one of those metaphors that we keep using. It's I suppose eventually you make another box, right? But yeah, I think without too much dependence on that cliche, that thinking in new ways is and getting excited about innovation, getting excited about your ability to do things in a way that can be acceptable in academia without following something that's 50 years old.
That's important. And I predicted about a year ago on Twitter that poetry is making a huge comeback, and it definitely is. Now as we're segueing into poetry, just want to say you're absolutely right. Poetry is nonlinear. We're moving in a nonlinear direction, and I think that is, maybe even that is kind of a result of what's happening in the more academic institutions. And But you had one really good, before we move into talk about how you became one of Canada's top 3 poets, and your upcoming book, and your wildly popular Wild Writers series, I think you have a really good piece of advice for, or observation really, for students when you're talking about the cover letter and how the authentic voice may help people get jobs. When we were chatting, I'd like you to say it, but essentially how students have this buzzwords and all this thing, and they're applying for jobs and not getting them, whereas the rise of the authentic voice may actually really change the job search field for younger people in their 20s.
Yeah, I think, transferring ideas, making sure that, that you are yourself in a cover letter or in your resume, that, and instead of using, I think these were really popular a few years ago, but I think like thinking outside of the box, or another tool in the toolbox, or I'm a team player, and all those kinds of buzzwords.
Yeah, self-starter.
A self-starter and all these kinds of things, that people wanted to sort of pepper their papers with these things, thinking that got them the job because that was what it was expected. But I mean, they become cliches quite quickly, I think, and that people who are able to express themselves in their own words, that, what in your own words means is kind of a tricky expression in and of itself.
Exactly, because again, you're kind of told what to say.
Yeah.
And the internet is still peppered with all of these, if you're looking for a job, there's so many articles out there that teach you how to use the buzzwords.
Sure, yeah.
And
but I mean, you have to say more than that. And I think that if you're just saying the buzzwords and you're not explaining yourself, somebody, a job posting today comes out in Toronto for a receptionist, you're going to have 200 applications,
Yeah.
right? How do you, as the person who really wants that job, stand out as being unique, as being the person that would be interesting to hire, the person you'd love to have at your front desk, right? Or whatever, kind of position it is. So how are you going to do that? It's not by using everybody's buzzwords that everybody else uses. Using your first person voice, explaining how maybe, what you do in your spare time connects to the, the tenacity or the diligence that you have or the passion you have for your job, is a way to, make yourself
Stand
interesting.
out.
Yeah, and
Well,
stand out.
I have a feeling that with the rise of the first person and the authenticity in the first person voice, which is a more authentic voice in academia, I have a feeling that within the next 2-3 years we will see that really being reflected in the job market and in those articles I'm talking about.
Yeah.
So let's tell our viewers about your writing series and your upcoming book. First, your upcoming book, now it's being published by Quattro Books. You're chosen, and I understand you won a competition, and you're one of Canada's top 3 poets, and you forayed back into creative writing finally after so much focus. Tell me a little bit about it.
Oh, well,
And when it's coming out.
I don't want to overstate the sort of what best means. I mean, it's best new poets. So
Okay.
Being new is always something kind of interesting or emerging and that kind of thing because, like many, like rock stars or something, right? People have been practicing for years, have been on the scene, have, and then they, win the first, the best new artist award or something like that. So being
Yeah, it
new
takes
to
time.
the,
No,
right?
there's no such thing as
not
overnight fame.
It's not like, I, wrote a poem last week for the first time and now I'm a best new poet. But also, it's, there's lots of contests and lots of, other poets who are absolutely amazing. So I don't want to say I'm like the best new poet or something, but the great thing is that Quattro Books had this contest and solicited manuscripts, and so they solicited partial manuscripts, and then they formed a long list of what they considered the top 10, and then they asked for the full manuscripts and narrowed it down to the top 3. And what I love about this is that they didn't make it a hierarchy and say like here's the runner-up and third place or something. They gave all of us the opportunity to publish our full manuscripts within, technically an anthology, I suppose, because we're all 3 together, but it's not your typical anthology where you have one of 100 poems or something.
Yeah,
right?
you've got it's essentially a collection because you've got about 50 poems in there, right?
Absolutely, yeah. So,
And along with Sarah Kambala and Tara Boren?
Yes, absolutely. So 2 other awesome poets that I'm really excited to, share this experience with.
That's amazing. So that launches in November. It's coming out. It's going to be available in November, I believe. And then you said it launches in the new year?
Yeah, so we're expecting launch at the supermarket in Kensington in late February, but Quattro's really hoping to have those books out and, published
great Christmas
to
gift.
put in their Christmas stocking. Absolutely, yeah, so probably late November.
Okay, perfect. And now if people want to purchase the book or get in touch with you, and also your Wild Writers series. So that hosts poetry and prose. It's once a month at Kensington Market.
It's only poetry.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Only poetry,
Yeah.
but it has 3 features. What I love
Two
about...
features.
Okay. 2 features. But
She
what,
said to be argumentative.
Yes.
We set this up.
it's all rehearsed. This is why we watch live. You get to catch the bloopers. And so it's 2 features. And but what I really do like about the event is that you pepper it with a numerous... you've got usually a nice 15 people or so on the open mic, and that's peppered in between the feature artists. Tell me I'm right with that fact.
We try to keep it to 12, but occasionally there's 15.
When I was
right?
there,
Yeah,
it was
yeah.
15.
It probably was, yeah, because it was a
Brandon Pitts
busy
was on.
night, right? So
It was a full house.
Yeah, so it is, yeah. So it's a lovely venue. It's a Poetry Jazz Cafe in Kensington Market on Augusta. So it's got great ambiance. It's a little jazz club. So first Tuesday of the month, I have 2 features who are usually, well-known published poets, and sometimes really emerging, like really exciting young emerging poets who are just kind of hitting the scene. And there's room for 12 to 15 people on the open mic. And yes, so there's not like you have the features and then you have to wait for the open mic and everybody leaves. So you have a couple of open mic poets
And everyone
opening,
gets
some in
their
between,
chance.
and everybody gets a turn. Yeah, so.
It's a very nice venue. It's really cozy, intimate. It's lovely, and its stores open at 7.
Yep.
And you're not on for December. I think that's the 1 month you take off.
January is the month I take off.
January, right.
So yes, so
And-
so we're so we've got one coming up first Tuesday in November.
Who are your next features?
And my next features are Stanley Pfefferman, who I
Oh.
think you're familiar with.
Yes, he's
and,
published in the
and-
Artis.
Absolutely,
Great
and
poet.
Charles C. Smith.
Oh, excellent. I
Yeah.
saw him at 100,000 Poets for Change at Pat Connors' event on the 22nd
Absolutely, and again, these
September.
are people who have both of them have new poetry books out this year, and both are really well-established poets, and both are awesome people to listen to. Really great, speakers and readers of their own works, and fantastic listeners, and I'm really excited to have them. Yeah.
Well, I will try to be there this month.
Absolutely.
And so everyone, to get in touch with Brenda, my gosh, with Georgia, Brenda is our next guest. To get in touch with Georgia and her Wild Writers reading series, you can find her on Facebook. The link should be going up onto the page on the screen. And you can also find Georgia Wilder on Facebook, friend her, come to the event, and follow her page, and then you will see when her book comes out with Quattro, which will be called The Best New Poets in Canada. And then she will have a launch party in February, which will probably be super awesome.
I'm really looking forward to it. Thank you.
And reach out to Georgia if you want to talk to her any more about the authentic voice and how that's changing our world. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you so much.
Okay.